Publication that I'm incredibly proud of, Chris Wilson's Growing Together Economic Ties Between the United States and Mexico. This is a true Wilson Center product. It is a publication whose genesis was found in a conversation between Chris and myself in his office one day, where he said, "Why are we not doing this?" And then we said, "How do we make it happen?" And then we spoke with Tony Wayne, and Tony was instrumental in getting us the funding for this. And then the entire team came together in a meaningful way to actually to make it happen. So this would be the moment where I'd like to say thank you to the entire team, obviously to Chris, to Angela, Andrea, Gina, Molly, Denise, Raquel, our friends from the Latin America program, in particular Crystal, who's here with us today. Thank you very much for all of your help. And to say a special mention as well to Antonio. Thank you very much for always supporting our work. And Carla, you're a great friend to the Mexico Institute, and we are incredibly grateful for your support. Chris, as you know, I'm very, very proud of you and all that you've done, and you're an inspiration, not just for me, but for many people here at the Wilson Center. So congratulations on this publication. Well done. And ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind taking your seats, Chris will kick off the final panel.
Great. So I'm really excited to finally have the copies of this report in hand. We've released some of aspects of this publication on the status of the U.S. Mexico economic relationship over time, but finally have the final report that has a lot of different dimensions to it. And when you embark on a project like that, you obviously end up owing a lot of people thanks for their support along the way. And so there are a few that I want to mention, starting with those who joined me today to help launch the report and have a discussion, not just about the report, but about the status of U.S. Mexico economic relations. Ambassador Carla Hills, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a longtime supporter of the Wilson Center, and is obviously one of the people who brought this bilateral economic relationship or trilateral economic relationship to you by helping negotiate, lead the U.S. negotiations on the North American Free Trade Agreement. And Antonio Ortiz Mena, a senior advisor with Albright Stonebridge, now a longtime head of the economic section at the Mexican Embassy here in Washington, also a good friend of ours and supporter along the way, provided some feedback to me actually as I was embarking on this project as well. Thanks to Duncan, thanks to Ambassador Wayne, thanks to Andrea Tanco and to Angela Budzinski here in our Mexico Institute team. Thanks also to Laura Baumann and Joseph Francois of the Trade Partnership. They helped do some of the economic modeling that provided some of the numbers that you'll see here today, specifically on jobs tied to trade. And then we had a huge number of research assistants that supported me along the way in this project, and I just want to say thanks to all of them. Gina, Hinojosa, and Molly are here right now, Raquel as well, and there are others that preceded them that I owe a debt of thanks to as well. Let me jump into things here. Oh. Well, maybe I won't. Can somebody try to make this thing work for me real quick while I get started? What's that? Okay. Yeah, just go one ahead, please. Thanks. So I'm just going to start by talking about, can you go one more, actually? The sort of the nature of the U.S. Mexico economic relationship. And I always use two words to describe it. The first one is big, and it's I know people in this room get this, but it can't be overemphasized. That, one of the reasons why it matters so much is just because of the magnitude of economic transactions that take place between our countries. They're talking about over $500 billion annually in trade between the United States and Mexico. That means there's over $1 billion of trade a day and more than $1 million of trade each minute that's occurring between the United States and Mexico. Mexico is the second largest export market for the United States. We export more to Mexico than we do to all of the, except for Canada, of course, is our number one export market. If you look at the top 10 trading export markets of the United States, it goes 1 Canada, 2 Mexico. If you take the rest of the top 10 combined, it doesn't add up to what Mexico equals. So we're talking about a hugely important export market for the United States. It's a big economic relationship, and that's one of the reasons why it matters. Can you go to the next one, please? One of the aspects of it that we looked into and that helps emphasize that the magnitude and the way in which it impacts the U.S. economy is by taking a deep look at the number of jobs in the United States tied to trade with Mexico. We've came up with a figure that there are around 5 million jobs in the United States that depend on trade with Mexico. That means if you were sort of to cut trade with Mexico tomorrow, you'd be putting that many jobs at risk. It's a net figure, which means that it takes into account jobs that are directly tied to exports, creation of exports to Mexico. It also takes into account the fact that there are jobs actually displaced by imports. If we're importing something from Mexico, we're not producing it here. And then it takes into account the indirect effects, the way that trade with Mexico changes pricing in the United States, the fact that a washing machine that you go out and buy costs less, therefore frees up some income among consumers in the United States that go spend that in other parts of the economy. So it's a net figure that takes all this into account. Basically, the point here, though, is just that taking all that into account, the net impact of this relationship is very positive. It's very much a plus to the U.S. economy. Go to the next one. The other word that I would use to qualify, to describe the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship is deep. We don't just sell things to each other, but we actually build them together. We have a deep sense of economic integration at this point. What that means is that we have built up over time this joint manufacturing platform that really spans across North America, where we have supply chains that feed factories across the border, supply chains that crisscross the borders of North America and especially the U.S.-Mexico border. What we see here are the value of foreign inputs for domestic production in either side. In the United States, from the United States being used in production in Mexico, that's the green line, and the value of Mexican inputs used in U.S. production, that's the red line. They're very similar, actually. It's a very balanced relationship in that sense. What we see is that there are over $100 billion worth of parts and materials coming from each side of the border, going to the other side of the border to be used as inputs in production, to help fuel production on the other side of the border. So we depend on one another to feed our factories and keep our factories running. And why do we choose to make those purchases from one another? Well, because they come at a good cost. They're produced well, they're good quality materials, and they come at a cost that is competitive. What that means is that we're feeding the competitiveness of one another by utilizing these cross-border supply chains. Let's see here. There we go. Great. So when Mexico exports, it exports U.S. content. Why? Because we're feeding into production processes in Mexico. How much U.S. content is being exported by Mexico? There's some different figures that help explain that in different ways. What we see is for general exports, according to new trade statistics produced by the WTO and OECD, is that around 12% of Mexico's gross exports to the world is actually made up of U.S. content. So that's U.S. parts and materials that go into Mexico, are used in production in Mexico, and then are exported to the rest of the world. The number can be higher depending on the methodology that you use. This actually ends up being a pretty conservative estimate compared to some of the other figures that have been put out along the way. There's an older number that is produced with a different methodology that shows that when we actually import goods from Mexico, final goods, not parts or materials, but final goods, on average 40% of the content in those goods, it was originally produced in the United States. Whatever the figure is, depending on how you ask the question, what methodology you use, what we see is that there's a significant amount, huge amounts, billions of dollars of U.S. materials, U.S. parts and material, U.S. value that's embodied in Mexican production and then sent back to the United States and sent around the world. There's some really important consequences of this deep type of economic integration, this deep sense of manufacturing integration. One, our business cycles are tightly linked together, and this has really happened since NAFTA. We experienced growth and recession cycles together. So when in 2009, Mexico entered recession, it wasn't because Mexico had a housing bubble or a structural problem in the Mexican economy. It was because Mexico's economy is tied very tightly to the U.S. economy, and we had experienced a deep economic recession. Those types of links are very strong. But it's deeper than that. Like I was talking about, it's also the fact that our competitiveness, even our productivity to a certain extent, is linked together. So when Mexico undertakes a series of economic reforms that improve Mexican productivity, so the telecom reform that lowers the price of telephone costs in Mexico, well, every company operating in Mexico, every producer in Mexico has a telephone bill. So when they pay a little bit less in their telephone bill, their production becomes a little bit more competitive. They can sell their goods at a little better price. And that means that U.S. producers that are buying goods from Mexico that are part of those joint supply chains are getting those goods at a little bit better price. That means they're a little bit more competitive on the world market. They're a little bit more able to fend off competitors from abroad, Chinese imports or imports from other parts of the world. They're able to get a little more market share here and perhaps export more to the other parts of the world as well as a result of that. It means that Mexican exports support U.S. jobs and industry. And what it means in a very important sense in the current political context, in the current state of negotiations, is that if we put a tax on imports coming in from Mexico, to a lesser extent, but to a very important extent, we're putting a tax on exporters in the United States who are feeding production in Mexico and then sending some of those goods back to the United States. It means that we need to be very careful about the way, the deep level of integration means that we have to be very careful about the implications for our own economy when addressing things that impact Mexico's economy and that impact our trading relationship with Mexico. There's a huge number of jobs created also by Mexican investment in the United States. This is something that's actually growing quite a bit. It's over 100,000 jobs in the United States. These are directly tied to Mexican investment. They're employees of Mexican companies operating in the United States. Companies like these, some of the companies I think we don't, so our image of Mexico is a little bit outdated in the United States, and sometimes we wouldn't think that Mexican companies can be such strong global players having such success in the United States. But it turns out there are many examples across the industries of that taking place. U.S. foreign and direct investment in Mexico is still much bigger than Mexican foreign direct investment in the United States. But Mexican foreign direct investment in the United States has more than doubled since 2007. So it's not only important in sort of the numbers of today, but if you're looking at trajectories, we should be looking for it to become increasingly important over time. It should continue that trend of importance. But in the United States, we've had, and I think the previous electoral cycle and this new administration represents this to a certain extent, there's been, despite the fact that there's mutual benefits to the relationship, there's this rising sense or a significant sense of trade skepticism, of skepticism regarding globalization in the United States. So, if there are these 5 million jobs that depend on trade, if there are these mutual benefits in terms of competitiveness linked to trade, well, why do we have that sense? I think it's a real question that deserves a real answer, and it will actually help us understand the challenge that we've gotten ourselves into in terms of the economic relationship right now as well, by understanding it at a deeper level. At the root, I would say, at the root of that trade skepticism, concerns about globalization, there's a real sense of economic insecurity that many families across the United States feel. The fact that real medium household income in the United States is still below its 1999 peak is troubling. It's concerning, and it should be for families across the United States and for us as a country. There's linked to that, and where you see it especially playing out is this decades-long trend. It's actually the biggest line that you see going down. This is like over 100 from 1840 to 1990. Employment in different sectors across the economy. We say agriculture went way down because agricultural productivity went way up over time. The middle line, the one that goes up and then down, is manufacturing. And the point there is just that, since the 1970s, we've seen this secular decline in manufacturing employment in the United States. Of course, that's happened, and this updates it to more recent numbers. Employment being the line that's going down, but manufacturing output or production being the line that's going up. That's occurring, this decline in manufacturing employment in the United States is occurring as we have an increase in manufacturing output in the United States. Well, how is that possible, or what does that mean? What it means more than anything is that productivity has been enhanced, especially in manufacturing. We're able to produce more stuff with less people. That, of course, is a challenge for those people who had jobs in manufacturing, and so it's a real challenge. But what's the source of that? What's causing that? Is Mexico the source of that, or other things the source of it? Well, no. The biggest cause certainly is technology. Technology, automation of factory lines, computer-aided production processes, business logistics improvements because of things like automation, computer communications improvements, all sorts of business processes improvements, major levels of productivity improvement, especially in manufacturing. Those are the cause of, according to some research from Ball State University, 85 to 87% of manufacturing job losses in the United States over the past several years. when you start, so there's some other good new research that's also asking similar types of questions. And they're asking, of course, even if we say there's 85% that are technology driven, that leaves 15% that are trade or globalization related. So that's significant, and we should ask ourselves, well, what's going on there? There's some other good new research by Otter, Dorn, Hansen, some similar research by a few others as well, that start asking the question of where are the manufacturing job losses related to trade coming from? They find that around a quarter of U.S. manufacturing job losses, so that's bigger than the 15 or 13% that the Ball State folks would suggest, were driven by U.S.-China trade over the last couple of decades. So the number that's exactly driven by technology versus trade is definitely up for some debate, but it's a huge chunk driven by technological advance and automation. Still some that are pushed in a similar direction because these are both types of skill-biased changes. So you have jobs for those with lower skills being lost, whether due to automation or due to competition from abroad, and jobs that are being created that are higher skill, higher pay, but they require higher levels of education to get those, and they're pushing in the same direction. What you don't see there is you don't see Mexico showing up as one of the big drivers of it. And looking across the literature, there are examples of specific industries, very specific geographic locations that may have been negatively impacted by growing trade between the United States and Mexico. That does exist. Those cases exist in which, a carrier type of case that we saw last fall, where a factory closes in one country and then opens up in another country. That zero-sum type of game exists at the anecdotal level or even at the very specific geographic or industry-specific level. But what you don't see is that being the storyline. And so some other really good new research from Lindsay Odensky and Ted Moran shows that actually when U.S. companies are growing their operations in Mexico, when they increase employment in Mexico, they're actually, on average, tend to be increasing employment in the United States, increasing exports from the United States, and the biggest increase actually is in research and development spending in the United States. So we have these, why is that? Why do we not have a zero-sum game? Because we're growing together. Why are we growing together and falling together when we fall? Because we're building things together, because our supply chains are deeply linked together, our production processes are deeply linked together. So if Mexico's not the driver of the underlying challenge that drove some of that trade skepticism, what does that mean in the current context? Well, the challenge is that it means that a reworking of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, a reworking of NAFTA, can't deliver on the fundamental part of the promise. That means we're in a difficult spot because there's been a promise after promise made to fix this very broken, as it's been described, agreement, NAFTA, between the United States and Mexico. So we're in a bit of an alley without a clear exit in terms of that. So how do we go forward? How do we get out? Well, I think one, we have to acknowledge we do need to do something about NAFTA. It's been promised and promised and promised. And frankly, that's okay, because there are things that we could do to update NAFTA. It's an agreement that was negotiated 25 years ago, before we all had smartphones in our pockets and before businesses found their buyers and sellers online. And so we can update it to include those things. Maybe we can also strengthen labor provisions. Maybe, if we're careful about it, we can also change some of the rules of origin to incentivize a greater use of content of parts from within North America compared to the parts that are used outside of North America. Let me actually just return to this real quick, which shows that actually the amount of the percentage, not the amount, not the value, but the percentage of U.S. content being used in production in Mexico has gone down over time. That's been as the use of Asian inputs in Mexican production has increased. And so maybe we can turn the tide on that. Actually, maybe the tide is being turned on that right now. These numbers are a little bit old. So we may have already reached an inflection point there. But maybe we can incentivize the use in specific industries carefully, thoughtfully, of using greater North American parts. But I don't know that an update to NAFTA will be enough. This is what concerns me. If NAFTA is not the cause of the underlying problem, then NAFTA being renegotiated can't solve the underlying problem. So what I would look for from a political standpoint are what else might be put on the table to help fill in that gap in terms of meeting the promise that was made to voters. Things like a border adjustment tax might fall in that category. But maybe there are some other ways to fill in that gap. I mean, I think that one of the yardsticks that's been used a lot by the new administration are announcements about jobs being created, investments being made. So maybe the private sector can jump in and help by, on the tail end of an NAFTA renegotiation, having a package of investments ready to launch, saying, if because of these improvements that are made, we're ready to create, X million jobs in the United States, invest X billion dollars in the U.S. economy as a result of that. I don't know. I don't know exactly what it will be. It's certainly a challenging scenario, but I think we should be thinking in that category. We've heard some about Mexico's reaction, and Antonio can certainly explain it better than I can as well. But I do think it's worth thinking about in the context of the current state of the economic relationship, how Mexico feels it needs to respond to the types of challenges that have been put out there right now. Over 80% of Mexico's exports go to the United States. So it's really important to understand that access to the U.S. market is a top order national interest. It's a vital national interest for Mexico. So when Mexico, over the last several months, has felt like that market access is being put on the line, it's looked around and said, well, if we engage in this negotiation, do we have sufficient leverage to get to an adequate outcome at the end of the negotiating process? And as Ambassador Sardokan stated, the answer to that internally was, we're not sure. We're not sure that we do have enough leverage. And so what will we do? Well, we'll take the relationship that has traditionally been compartmentalized so that sugar doesn't get in the way of security cooperation, and security cooperation or challenges on security don't get in the way of, tomatoes being traded, and we're going to put it all on the table. And so the relationship has been decompartmentalized in that sense from a Mexican perspective. So everything's on the table in order to have maximum leverage. But now, interestingly, especially as we're careening towards 2018 elections in Mexico, the situation has started to work in the other direction as well. We're seeing contamination coming from other issues, making the trade negotiations more complicated. And we probably should have seen this coming, but the fact that, as from a Mexican standpoint, having elections coming means that you want to wrap this up as quickly as you can before things get even more complicated, before it becomes even harder to make anything that might resemble a concession in a negotiation that will inevitably require concessions from both sides. So from the Mexican perspective, though you'd like to see it go quickly, there are reasons why we're not seeing things move quickly. Some of them are structural. Trade Promotion Authority in the U.S. requires a 90-day notification period to Congress. You have to come up with clear negotiating objectives in conjunction with Congress before you can really even get to that point. There are these structural factors that are there, combined with the fact that we still don't have a full trade team in the United States. We don't have a USTR that's been confirmed. It means that this process is moving a little slower than we thought it would. So Mexico would have loved to help move us towards a quick resolution, but that's challenging. And then in the meantime, we have front page stories about immigration raids taking place, about Mexican families being torn apart and people being deported, and a number of other sort of challenging rhetorical pieces of the narrative, whether it's paying for the wall or things like that. So the space for making concessions has been narrowed. We've really created along the way, a huge set of promises from the U.S. side to be fulfilled to voters. And when you add it all up together, we've created a minefield, a political minefield that needs to be navigated in order to get through this difficult period in the economic relationship without having real damage on the ground to the U.S. or the Mexican economy, because there's real risks from both sides. And so let me just not stop at a really somber, horrible spot and just say, despite that, I have a couple of reasons for hope. One of those is that as the 5 million jobs figure suggests, as if you look at the number of exporting companies from the United States to Mexico suggests, there are a huge number of stakeholders throughout the United States that are deeply invested in this economic partnership. It was difficult for them, especially while things were moving quickly, and there were other things on the table like major corporate tax structure changes, while companies were getting tweeted at and losing X percentage of their shareholder value, in a day. It was difficult for them to figure out how to engage. Well, the slowing down of the process is actually allowing them to come out of the woodwork and engage the policy process in a meaningful and constructive way. That's really useful. The other one is simply that if we've created this mutually beneficial relationship over the last 25, 30 years, well, there are real benefits. And the fact that there are real benefits for both countries means that damaging the relationship, gets rid of those benefits. It has costs, not just for Mexico, but also for the United States. And we've seen that, whether it's Mexican cooperation on issues of preventing terrorist attacks from ever occurring in the United States that involve a crossing through Mexico, or issues of Central American migration and managing migration, or whether it's, the economic ties between the two sides, there are, both stakeholders and interests that really have pushed us in the direction of deeper cooperation and that are now there, as long as you allow them sort of the time and space to play out, to keep this relationship as solid as it's been built up to be over the last several years. So let me, with that, stop there and sit down and ask Ambassador Carla Hills and Antonio Ortiz-Mena to offer some thoughts and comments, and then we can all engage in a discussion. Thank you. Sorry about that. There we go. Yep.
Well, Chris's report and his colleagues that really does a masterful job in setting forth the facts of why this bilateral relationship is absolutely critical. I don't have to tell this audience that our nation is confronting enormous political and economic uncertainty. Globalization has been under attack here, but also more broadly across the universe. And that's a dramatic change for us because we've been the leader in featuring open markets. Since World War II, whether under Democratic or Republican administrations, the United States has firmly believed that opening markets to goods, services, investment, ideas will advance our Americans' future. And as President Kennedy said, a rising tide raises all boats. President Trump's statements, both before the election and after, make it clear that he's not convinced. And on the campaign trail, he called the NAFTA I quote, the worst trade deal ever signed. And we need to get the facts out, and this report just has some wonderful accumulation of why Americans should care about the bilateral relationship and the NAFTA in particular. Chris has mentioned that Canada and Mexico, we have created a $19 trillion market with 490 million consumers. Mexico is our second largest export destination. We sell more to Mexico than we sell to all the rest of Latin America combined. We sell more to Mexico than we sell to France, Germany, Great Britain, and the Netherlands combined. And the president has made clear that his two objectives, create jobs and to increase exports. Well, it's important to point out and get the public to know that 60% of our imports are intermediate goods that make our exports more competitive, and that is part of your report. And Chris asked if I would say a word about the future. I believe that we will have a negotiation, a renegotiation. I cannot believe that in the interests of our country, we would actually gravitate to pulling out of the NAFTA. Our interlinked supply chains would be devastated. We would lose probably 5 million jobs, which is in the report. In addition, we would lose a lot of goods that we really want to keep coming in. I love the statement that Senator Graham said. Any proposal that drives up the costs of Corona, tequila, or margaritas is a very bad idea. Could the NAFTA be updated? Absolutely. And, we sat down at the table in 1991, and in the quarter century since, issues like the digital economy, e-commerce did not exist. You didn't have a cell phone. The the idea that we would want to protect data flows or prohibit data localization just never even came to mind. And these are critical issues today. Other issues like non-trade issues, labor and environment, could formally be brought into the agreement. There's heightened awareness in all of our countries around the world of these issues. They're certainly more important here, both politically and awareness is higher. One element of the agreement that the administration has mentioned as a must in any renegotiation is the dispute settlement mechanism. Well, it's important to recognize that the agreement has 3 separate dispute settlement mechanisms. One deals with the agreement overall. And an element that has caused some contention and could be removed is the ability of a government to block a panel or slow a panel from hearing a case by delaying the appointment of a panelist that would be hearing the case. And it's unclear, however, whether the 3 governments would be willing to limit their power to in that fashion. But that's an idea. I mean, if you want to deal with dispute settlement, that's the one that deals with the overall agreement. Secondly is the investment state dispute settlement. Very much in the discussions. It's politically sensitive and little understood, I think, in the United States. Since February of 2016, the last time I looked, the United States hasn't lost a case. As an old lawyer, I would agree that arbitration is faster and cheaper than going to the courts. So it's unclear what the current administration would want to focus on when actually we have been a winner in the cases, and it may not want to take a public position that appears to safeguard outgoing investment, since it thinks of exports as being good and foreign outward investment as being bad. But it's a possibility. And thirdly is a mechanism for resolving disputes on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. I don't know whether the administration would see this as a means to undermine our anti-dumping and countervailing duty determinations when they put a lot of emphasis on enforcement. But it's another idea that you could deal with these issues. In an effort to renew and refresh the NAFTA, I believe the negotiators would benefit from reviewing all the new areas, and they would be helped, in my opinion, by looking at what we negotiated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because there we dealt with the digital economy, e-commerce, labor and the environment, ensuring that state-owned enterprises compete on a commercial basis, and protecting digital flows, prohibiting data localization. So we could deal with those things, and that would probably be a great idea. The President has expressed a preference for a bilateral, not a trilateral agreement. I think that issue has subsided. I think he's walked back from that. I happen to prefer the trilateral approach. But there are issues that we could deal with bilaterally. We did with Canada and agriculture in the initial agreement. We have an agreement to open agriculture with Mexico, but Canada decided to sit that one out. But the most important thing is that we get the facts out and that we talk to the stakeholders here in the United States about what we would lose if we make this mistake of pulling out of or diminishing this extremely important economic agreement. Everyone in this room should take it on as a mission to talk to someone who says, NAFTA, what's that? And explain to them how critical it is. And if they're talking to political operatives, that push for this agreement to be sustained and maintained and upgraded. And this report that, you did give me a copy.
I did.
Okay, I have a copy here. But this report, you ought to just have about 1 million copies sent around. So keep it up. You've done a great, great job.
Thank you so much, Carla. Appreciate that. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this on?
It should be. They're turning some off to prevent the fuzz.
Oh, no. So it is really an honor to. No? Still have something to say here. Okay? No, I got it. I got it.
They got it. They got
I
it.
guess maybe someone doesn't want to hear me. So, it really is an honor to be here with Ambassador Hills discussing the work of Chris Wilson. I followed his work for a number of years, and he's been steadfast when NAFTA was in fashion, when it was not in fashion, when it was forgotten. Now it's in the limelight, but you stuck through it. So congratulations on doing this. And it's also an honor to be here with Ambassador Hills. I hope we get the chance to discuss more works. I remember a couple of years ago, we presented a book of our dear Sydney Weintraub at CSIS. We shared a panel that, but we need much more research done on NAFTA and on Mexico-U.S. Relations. So I will make a plug. I know there are a number of companies here represented. I teach at the Wall School at Georgetown, and we're trying to revive the Mexico chair. So if anyone is interested in helping or supporting that, you're more than welcome. I see Eric there from AU, and our dear Bob Pastor was a force of nature, and he headed the Center for North American Studies. So please, help bring some life back into the Center for North American Studies.
Well, and I have to give a plug while you give that opportunity. They've actually started very recently the North American Research Initiative,
Right.
sort of in honor of the legacy of Bob Pastor, and it's a fantastic,
Right.
fantastic initiative.
And I was with Ambassador Davidow just a couple of weeks ago at UC San Diego, my alma mater, at the Center for U.S Mexico Studies, presenting some new research. So again, just please, be more involved. We need more voices and more information, more informed debate. Okay, so that's enough for the plug. Okay, and I'll speak very briefly about the report itself, and then I'll share some of my views about the future of NAFTA. First of all, it is a very thorough report. It brings some very recent research to the general public, like the Moran-Oldemsky that Chris quoted. There's also some original research. It's very thorough. He even manages to bring Brad Pitt into the equation. If you want to know how, you have to read the report. But Brad Pitt is in this report, believe me. Okay. Now, regarding trade, I think Chris does a wonderful job of showing not only how trade is big, but how it has changed qualitatively, the type of trade, intra-firm and intra-investment trade. He did some interesting calculations. He actually uses the Grubel-Lloyd index. It's getting a bit wonkish here, but I hadn't seen that cited in a long time, and only Canada has a higher value in the Grubel-Lloyd index for its trade than Mexico, U.S. Mexico's about the same as Germany, and higher than China, than Japan. This is just another measure of intra-industry trade. And what I would say is no matter how you slice it, you see that there's a very high degree of interdependence in terms of trade. Maybe for a next edition, you might want to look at other indexes or look at how trade is similar or not. There's something called the Trade Similarity Index, and last I checked, the value of that index was higher for Mexico and China than for Korea and China. So there's greater complementarity between Mexico and the U.S., and quite a challenge between Mexico and China. Just some thoughts. And in terms of investment, again, you showcase how not only the U.S. invests in Mexico, but Mexico invests in the U.S., and that's closely linked to trade. One of the previous panelists mentioned that NAFTA is not only about trade, but about investment. And trade and investment are actually complementary. If you look at not only at intra-industry trade, but intra-firm trade, you will see that that's a big driver of integration. I see representatives here from Ford, from GE. I'm sure they could provide some examples, and I think it would be useful to have some examples so that people do understand the numbers. Sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole picture. Looking forward, I think it might be interesting to do some prospective estimates. For example, Gordon Hanson recently used the gravity model, the gravity equation, to estimate North American trade flows, and he shows that they will be growing greatly more so with NAFTA than without NAFTA. But that's one way of looking at things. And secondly, I was reminded of a PricewaterhouseCoopers report called the World Economy in 2050. They issue it every other year, so it came out just last month. And according to their latest estimates, in 2050, Mexico will be the world's #7 economy. So it'll be larger than the UK or France or Germany or Japan and, yes, Canada. And this, I think, is important for the U.S.'s long-term interests, as Ambassador Wayne said. The U.S. has to keep its focus on its long-term interests. And if Mexico and the U.S. are interdependent right now, this will only increase over time as the Mexican economy grows. So where do we go from here? I do believe that NAFTA can be updated. I don't like the word renegotiate. It's like starting from scratch. It's as if, you know, something went wrong. No, I think something went right 25 years ago, okay? And we have a very different world, and it is, you know, time to update it, to modernize it. I do agree with the importance of including new issue areas like e-commerce, but maybe with a qualification. I think NAFTA was a relatively rigid agreement. It's, you know, very, very long, very detailed, and all the rules are set out there. It's difficult to amend it in any substantive way. Given the rapid pace of technological change, it would be interesting to see how you could have a more flexible, a more living agreement. For example, a couple of years ago, the McKinsey Global Institute issued a report on 12 technologies that will change the way we produce and trade, and they have to do with, you know, genomics or 3D printing, you know, the Internet of Things, the cloud. We still don't know where that will lead. So we need an agreement that will be able to deal with the future technologies, not to always be trying to play catch up. So we would need a more creative, a more flexible agreement from that perspective. That's one item. A second item, I would also underscore dispute settlement. Ambassador Hills mentioned Chapter 20. That's the interstate dispute settlement. I do think that as trade increases, and trade will increase just, you know, for secular reasons, and because Mexico will be one of the world's largest economies, you need a more effective way to deal with interstate disputes, and the composition of panels has become a problem. So I would wholeheartedly support, you know, modifying Chapter 20. Regarding Chapter 11, that has nothing to do with bankruptcies. That's the NAFTA chapter that deals with investor states disputes. I don't see why it would be in the self-interest of the U.S. to do away with that at any point, especially right now that they have a lot of investment in fixed assets. For example, a lot of the pipelines that are in Mexico transporting the gas that Duncan mentioned are owned by a U.S. company and others by a Canadian company, okay, by Sempra and by TransCanada. ExxonMobil won the bid for deep water oil. So, you know, those are huge investments with a long-term horizon. You need stability and a quick way to resolve disputes that could arise. On Chapter 19, which is the anti-dumping countervailing duty binational panel review, I don't see how the Mexican government could accept doing away with it, given that the U.S. government says it will really focus on enforcement. Okay, so we need to have that, Chapter 19 for enforcement. And finally, one thing that's outside the scope of the agreement, but I think it's worth bringing it to the discussion, and that has to do with infrastructure. If you look at global rankings and see where North America is in terms of, you know, the top airports or more efficient airports or ports, we do dismally, especially the U.S. and Mexico. In the U.S., you have heard for years about the quote-unquote crumbling infrastructure. And I think that one way to make the whole region more competitive is to focus on infrastructure, but from a regional perspective as opposed to a national perspective that could help create jobs in the whole region, in the short term, but also set the basis for future needs. So I think that's outside the scope of the agreement, but we do need to think about how we're doing in that regard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Antonio. So, yeah, we have time for just a few questions, but it looks like we have one here in the middle and then Raul over there as well. If you could all please just introduce yourselves as you ask them.
Thank you. Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Being a questioner and not a panelist, I'll be very short, but I remember I started this in 1980 when I heard President Reagan suggest a North American free trade agreement during the time. It's great to be in an it's great to be a bureaucrat during transitional changes because you can sneak into a cabinet meeting before everybody warms up, but he heard that. I hear this discussion and I don't think it rings in the area. I don't think it rings in the hinterland. My view is very simple. One, Texas must stand up and must get people to vote and say, renegotiation, great, cover all these issues and all the wonk issues, fine, but we will not accept the ending of NAFTA. It's as simple as that. And you get as many bipartisan people to say, okay, renegotiate if you want, but in no way do we even want to discuss ending the particular agreement. As far as the agreement goes itself, it's upon Mexico to begin discussing topics that the U.S. is embarrassed about. If you're going to discuss rules of origin and think all you can do, I'm going to really slow up because you're going, all you can do is talk about automobile rules of origin, let the Mexicans bring up a bunch of origin rules and tell them how hard it is to begin negotiating these changes. So they should put these particular subjects on the table. But the main point I make is, this is a unique administration, and it's to its credit, it has never put together more entrepreneurial successes as in the cabinet and the advisory committee. The king emerges, the head of Goldman Sachs, the head of the largest hedge fund, they're there. So what I would be suggesting is that we begin moving away from the legalistic attitude, the legalistic approach, and get the businessmen to talk to each other. Get the Japanese automobile industries to begin talking with their American counterparts, Mexican counterparts. Let me stop there because, as I said, it's a very dangerous subject discussed for 50 years, but thank you so much. This has been the best panel, the best discussion because you have all the facts on the table. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Raul? And then we have to take one last one.
Yeah, Raul Hinojosa, UCLA. Very good. We're actually going to generate a map that's going to have the counties of the job impact. But I wanted to talk about what I think has really been missing and should have been started in the first negotiations, which is really this issue of labor adjustment and the fact that in a sense we've ignored it and it has now grown to this monster which is eating NAFTA and is eating the relationship. I mean, if you really look at it, the impact of job losses in the United States should have been a top priority from day one to identify and to make sure that adjustments could take place so that you would not have the specter of this massive, as Ross Perot would call it, the huge sucking sound, right? But here we have it. We have a huge sucking sound that is eating up this entire discussion. So as a part of this, it turns out we did an alter type analysis. If you look at the economic benefits from the export areas, it would more than compensate close to $100,000 per worker that would lose their job, all right? So, we need to take this seriously. I think the Wilson Center should take it seriously in terms of making sure that we, especially in the current environment where the discussion is now redefining around jobs. Finally, wages. I mean, we're entering into a really interesting period between the United States and Mexico with a possible upswing in the ability of worker welfare to rise, particularly on the Mexican side, and the adjustment issues on the U.S. side should be identified specifically for what they are, not tied with trade with Mexico. And finally, migration. It turns out if you do the same map with jobs related to migration, Mexican immigrants produce much more GDP in the United States than multiple times than the trade relationship does. So direct and indirect. So that's also coming out too, which is a part of what we have to put into the equation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then last question, Richard Downey, I think it is.
Thank you. Richard Downey from Delphi Strategic Consulting. Thanks for a wonderful discussion. Very, very interesting. One of the things that we've talked about here is the concern on the part of Mexico for the renegotiation or whatever's going to happen in NAFTA. You know, it always seemed over the years that there was an element in Mexico, usually in the academic community, that always talked about how negative NAFTA was for Mexico. And this is a question, I think, Chris, you might know. What is the impact now? Is that community sort of rejoicing, or is this, they sort of muffled their criticism, or what's happening now? This isn't my area. This is really a question. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Do you want to start? We can each take a couple minutes and respond to any of the questions we'd like, and then we'll finish the panel that way.
Whatever.
Go ahead, Antonio, you want to start? We'll come down the way.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, several issues. On rules of origin, it is right to point out that the share of regional inputs has been slightly declining over time, as Chris said. But it's important when you renegotiate rules of origin to make sure that they're not too high, so that you lose competitiveness, you disrupt your supply chains. That is to say, you're not only producing for the region, you're producing for third countries. And if you have to use more expensive inputs because of higher regional content requirements, then you might win a Pyrrhic victory. You will lose competitiveness in third markets. Also, if they are set too high, remember that Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. are members of the WTO. So they could say, I won't be bothered with all this red tape to show that I'm fulfilling rules of origin. I'll use the MFN tariffs and just forget about this. So it could backfire. You know, it's a bit of a Goldilocks issue. Not too low, not too high. It's very tricky. Now, on jobs, I do want to mention something. It is always very complicated to talk about trade and jobs, and I don't think we'll ever settle this question. When I teach my trade course, I talk about boring stuff like Heckscher-Ohlin and Stolper-Samuelson and blah 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 blah, and all you focus on is the more efficient allocation of resources. You're relatively agnostic about employment effects, and even if trade does have some employment effects, there are many causes that affect employment, including monetary policy, exchange rate policy, and technological change. So I think it's not a good idea to talk so much about trade and jobs, because I think this will be an endless. I've tried it for a number of years, and maybe I've started to give up. I think it's better to talk about how regional trade and investment can help bring prosperity to certain regions in the U.S. that are hurting, to certain regions in Mexico, like the Southeast, that are hurting. And I think that's a better way to address this, and ideally to have some companies providing examples about how trade and investment works to lift boats on both sides of the border. And a lot of companies have been pretty hesitant. I guess they don't want to be the object of a tweet. But, at some point, companies will have to start speaking up. I don't think it's enough, say, for the U.S. Chamber to speak up. I think companies need to come up with specific examples and show why this is something positive. And finally, on Mexican attitudes towards trade and NAFTA, I'll be glad to share with you the links to a public opinion survey done by CIDE, by the Center for Economic Research and Teaching in Mexico. We issue a report every 2 years on Mexican public opinion on a host of issues, including NAFTA. And I would say, overall, the views of NAFTA are pretty favorable across the board. Of course, they do believe that the grass is greener on the other side. They believe that it's been good for Mexico and the U.S., but it's been better for the U.S. than for Mexico. Apparently here, the view is not exactly the same. And in terms of the former critics of NAFTA, I would say that right now, I don't see virtually any of them celebrating. They think that, at the end of the day, NAFTA has been positive. Maybe it has not been enough, but I don't see, the NAFTA critics saying, finally. In a way, I, together with a number of friends who participated in the negotiations back then, I guess in a way feel vindicated. And I just want to end by stating what I believe is at stake in this, critical juncture of the relationship. It's not only, the rule of origin or Chapter 19 or whatever, but it's the whole bilateral relationship. When NAFTA was being negotiated, a lot of Mexicans were against it. They thought that the U.S. economy would destroy the Mexican economy, that the Mexican foreign policy would be aligned with the U.S. Foreign policy. None of that happened. But when some members of the U.S. administration behave in the way they behave, and they make the pronouncements they make, it brings up a bad past and a bad history, and it is very difficult to build trust again. I cannot underscore this enough. Much more than NAFTA is at stake.
Some very bad words were said on the campaign trail. I would have sent my children to their room had they spoken in that fashion. But you asked a question about, and ended with a suggestion that business talk about the NAFTA. I agree with that. I think the Chamber, the Business Roundtable, individual executives, but more than that, I think it's important that companies talk to their employees. If it's a small company, put it on the bulletin board. If it's a large company and you have an elevator, you have those elevator TVs, put the facts on that TV. And importantly, when you give out the paycheck and the W-2, put in that W-2 that 37% of our revenues come from North America, and 37% of your income on this check came from North America, because the populism is not at the Chamber of Commerce level. It is below the Chamber of Commerce and in the Rust Belt, and I think that the people that need to be educated are not reading these reports, as fine as they are, and are probably not even reading the Financial Times, but they will read their check. So that's one point. Second point on the labor adjustment. It's not something that we would negotiate with Mexico. It's a domestic issue. We have been woefully deficient. There are so many things that we should be doing, whether it is the tax credit, or whether it is a stipend so that if you lose your job, to automation. I mean, Chris pointed out that we are, compared to our output 10 years ago, creating more output with half as many workers. And so those workers are displaced because of automation and technology, not because of international competition. But if you lose your job, you don't care what the cause is. And so if you want to have support for good economic policy, then you need to move these people. Now, you mentioned about trade and creating jobs. The objective of trade is to make you more productive and move you up the scale. It has done that in manufacturing in the United States. We last year had a record output in manufacturing with 40% fewer workers than we had a decade ago. That has moved those people up. But jobs have been created in terms of services, design, technology, reading blueprints, and fixing robots. We have 4 million jobs that are crying for skilled workers. This doesn't mean they need a doctorate or a college degree, but the person who's been laid off because of technology needs help, and that's a domestic issue. And we do want to continue to move up the value chain. That's what trade does. But we have to help those that are displaced in the course of doing that. And so I agree that we need a domestic program. We need to get the report out. We need to have businesses talk to their employees. But we really need to keep the NAFTA. And we talk about if we pulled out, quite amazingly, we don't have a bilateral investment treaty with Mexico. So our investment in Mexico would be without an enforcement mechanism. And I think that businesses ought to be aware of that. That's not covered by any other agreement other than what we have now. And so we better hang on to it. So.
Thank you. So yeah, let me just close with a couple quick responses. In terms of states getting involved in the debate, Stephen, I mean, I think absolutely we should be looking for states like Texas, but also states like Michigan that also have massive levels of exports to Mexico and maybe a more complex political environment to be getting involved. I think that a few of them, and Texas is right on the top of my list, are really well positioned to have a strong influence, but are still battling some of their own sort of internal conflicts of taking a position and taking a stance, how electoral politics plays into that. But I do think that that's a key piece of it. On rules of origin, just to supplement what Antonio already said, I think from the U.S. perspective, if we're going to get into a discussion of rules of origin and negotiation on it, we need to ask, and as far as I can tell, the ITC, the International Trade Commission, is the only part of the U.S. government that has this technical capacity. We need to ask them to do a very serious study of industry by industry what changes to rules of origin would do to production and jobs in the United States. We need to know that before we can negotiate it. The other alternative is to do really extensive stakeholder outreach across any of the industries that you're looking at. And so maybe we're only looking at very specific industries, and maybe we can do it through that other way. But we do need to be very careful with that topic. There's I think some potential there, but we need to be careful not to raise them too high so as to disrupt supply chains. I mean, on labor adjustment, this is what we're paying the cost right now of not having done a good job previously on this issue, right? I mean, we know the wins are bigger than the losses, but if you don't take some of the wins and invest them in those who are undergoing this very difficult process of transition, this major structural, decades-long process of transition, if you don't invest in those people, then you're going to end up in the situation that we're in right now. And this is, I mean, more and more, human capital is the center of everything. I mean, this is the key type of capital that it's really all about at this point in terms of being competitive. And so making those investments makes an endless amount of sense. And it's really, the scary part is that it's the missing piece of the discussion right now, is that we're having such a strong discussion about NAFTA in terms of trade and deficits and this and that, but not about workforce development. And that's the heart of the issue ultimately, is having a discussion about how it's much more of a domestic issue in terms of how it actually gets played out. But we in the United States need to refocus some of the discussion onto issues of workforce development if we want to get to outcomes that can really turn the tide, that can really deliver to those who need some solutions delivered to them. And then finally, yeah, I agree. I think the amazing thing that's happened here in this debate is that when you really put NAFTA up on the chopping block, even its strongest critics back away from chopping it. That doesn't mean they don't want to see changes, and there are some that are offering constructive changes that have been some of the labor constituencies that have been traditional critics of NAFTA. They're still there criticizing the agreement, and they're looking for changes, but no one's out there saying let's get rid of this thing. And that's, I would say, basically true on both sides of the border. You do see some in Mexico saying we welcome a renegotiation. We welcome major revisions, and we would, do them in a different way. And there's, of course, political posturing mixed with sort of on-the-ground issues that drive those on both sides of the border. Again, but it's been amazing the way that we've seen even some of the most strident critics become not necessarily advocates, but more nuanced in their position. I mean, that's the difference. When being in opposition is easy, right? You get to wave your arms and say that's bad, 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 bad. But when it comes to governing, when it comes to actually making decisions that have on-the-ground consequences, you have to be more subtle, more nuanced, more thoughtful. And we're seeing a group of people come into that category right now, which is a fascinating process unfolding. Thank you all so much, not only for being here for this panel, but for being here for all of the sessions today. Really appreciate the opportunity at the Mexico Institute to have you all here and to engage in a real serious conversation about the relationship. Thanks again for coming.
Great job, Chris.
Thank you.
Can I have
You can have all of them. You can have as many as you like.
To Alec.
Please. And if you